All right, I believe we can get started and more people will join us as we go along. Once again, I would like to thank you all for joining us for this webinar. Allow me to mention that this webinar is being brought to you by the Chartered Cities Institute in partnership with the Zambia Association of Manufacturers. We are very proud to be providing this platform to share some really insightful findings from the research paper that will be presented by Professor Matthew McCartney. But beyond that, to also provide a platform where we can have mutual learning, exchange of ideas on the economic impacts of the brewing industry in different contexts. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mwanda Mwewa, African Lead for the Charter Cities Institute. And on behalf of the Charter Cities Institute and the Zambia Association of Manufacturers, once again, welcome. Allow me to just highlight a few housekeeping issues. Our webinar is scheduled for 1 hour, 30 minutes. We will start with the presentation by Professor Matthew McCartney, whom I will introduce in a bit more detail in a little while. We will then get some insights, overall impressions of the paper, as well as the role of beer in economic development by our two discussants. This is Ms. Kalemba Mpandamwike from the Zambia Institute for Policy Analysis and Research, and from Mr. Zondwayo Duma from the Zambia Association of Manufacturers. Thereafter, ladies and gentlemen, we will invite you, our distinguished guests, to join in the conversation. Please, we do invite you to post your question in the Q&A tab, which should be on your screen. Alternatively, during the Q&A session, you can raise your hand and we will facilitate for you to speak so that you can pose your question or offer that comment. Lastly, we will have some closing remarks from the Chief Executive Officer of the Zambia Association of Manufacturers. Second housekeeping issue that I'd like to highlight. Kindly note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available to everyone via email. Beyond that, it will be available on our various social media platforms, as well as that of the Zambia Association of Manufacturers. Lastly, I would like to mention that the paper has been published and is available for download on the Chartered Cities Institute website. So I invite you all to download the paper so that you can read in more detail the research findings and the role of beer in economic development. Without much further ado, allow me to introduce my colleague and our presenter, Professor Matthew McCartney. By way of introduction, Professor Matthew McCartney has spent several years, more than 20 years, as an academic at the School of African and Oriental Studies, University of London, as well as at the University of Oxford. He has been a visiting professor at universities in China, Pakistan, India, Japan, South Korea, Poland, and Belgium. He is a development economist by background with a teaching and research specialization in the development of India as well as Pakistan. He has published, supervised, and taught on economic issues relating to industrialization, technology, trade, the role of the state, investment, and economic growth, as well as human development issues relating to nutrition, employment, education, poverty, and inequality. He has also worked for the World Bank, for USAID, for the EU, and UNDP, as well as worked in Botswana, Georgia, a few other countries, including Zambia. He holds a BA in economics from the University of Cambridge, an MPhil in economics from the University of Oxford, and he has a PhD in economics from SOAS University of London. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce Matthew and maybe just state that he has a soft spot for Zambia. And I suspect that this particular research topic could have been inspired by his appreciation for the Mosi Lager. And on that light note, let me pass this over to Matthew. Matthew, please take us through the paper. You have 30 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you for that kind introduction, and definitely more than a soft spot for Zambia. I'm kind of very passionate about Zambia, not just because of the Mosi beer. Okay, let me share my screen. Right, I hope that is. Right, I hope that's come up okay. You can see the screen without any problems. Great. Okay, So I feel a bit of a fraud here. I kind of put together a rather grotty looking Word document, PowerPoint, and my two lovely colleagues in comms, Katie and Gemma, turned it into this rather lovely PowerPoint. So please do enjoy the aesthetics, but don't praise me for them. Okay, so to bear or not to be, bear a liquid history of economic development, I think mainly for the purposes of this presentation, Zambia, but I will draw on some references to Canada. So the introduction, I will kind of talk a little bit about the research paper, less about the Lusaka and Toronto blogs, which are kind of a bit more of a kind of a fun element to those. I'll talk about what motivated me to undertake this research, a number of caveats or let's say limitations to the research, kind of the main section there, why, in my opinion, brewery and beers and brewery make for a good anchor tenant. So by anchor tenant, I'm thinking here of a kind of a big first investor or first factory, and one that generates linkages with the rest of the economy. So a kind of an investment that can pull up other parts of the economy, as opposed to what we might think of as an enclave investment, an investment which generates few linkages with the local economy, where everything it produces is exported, all of its inputs are imported. And I will generate some policy recommendations at the end there. And I think what's interesting or unusual about this presentation is that I'm going to explicitly recommend that there are no policy changes I would recommend. This is really about policy implementation and policy presentation. So a kind of slightly unusual policy brief that recommends no changes in policy. Okay, motivation. This, I think in part this was inspired by what Mwanda mentioned as a kind of a long passion for Zambia. I spent 2 years living in Zambia in the late 1990s, so I'm something of a veteran when it comes to sipping the occasional mozzie. This was more directly inspired by two trips I did at the end of last year to Toronto and to Lusaka. So Toronto has become famous as a global city, but it's very evident that drinking beer is part of what makes Toronto a global city. Beer is often a social drink. It's drunk outside the household with groups of people, and it was very clearly apparent beer is kind of a social lubricant that has contributed to assimilating people into becoming Canadians, turning them from migrants into Canadians. It's part of, after work, that gossip, what we as economists call knowledge exchange or knowledge spillover. So beer was clearly central to what makes Toronto a global city. Lusaka, I lived in Zambia, in Lusaka, for 2 years in the late 1990s, and going back there 20 years later, it was very obviously a visible explosion of a kind of urban cafe, pub, restaurant culture, and that is closely bound up with the obvious emergence of a professional urban middle class in Lusaka, and beer is part of that. So it's quite odd, surprising that given these perceptions of a kind of a positive, interesting role for beer in Toronto and Lusaka, is that much of the literature has a negative perception or presents alcohol in a negative way. So this a book I read whilst I was in Toronto, Biography of a City, published a couple of years ago, which is entirely negative about the role of beer and brewing in the history of Toronto, linking it to crime, to prostitution, and to political corruption. I will, slightly later in the presentation, I'll also suggest that there's something similar going on in Zambia, this portrayal of beer and brewing in a very negative way. I'll illustrate that with some quotes later. A perception of good things, but a kind of other people, other scholars portraying beer in a negative way. A second big motivation is the rise of beeronomics, a kind of rather splendid subdiscipline of economics that looks at the impact between the history of beer, the history of brewing, and the history of economics, arguing that beer and brewing has a much more central role in human history and social and economic development than we hitherto imagined. That's one rather lovely quote about the kind of the grand historical importance of brewing. There's a couple of books, beeronomics publications that I read as part of this research. A couple of caveats. Although I'm focusing here on the positive contribution beer and brewing can make, I'm aware of negative impacts of alcohol. It has dependence producing properties. There are health implications of drinking. I'm aware of that. I'm not going to dwell on that in this presentation. I'm rather going to make the argument that I'm acknowledging health implications, but there are lots of potential positive developmental impacts from beer and brewing. One kind of justification or another justification is that here I'm focused on beer, whereas I think, well, spirits, as we call them in the UK, or liquor, we call them in the US, or harder alcohols, a lot of the problems from alcohol come from consumption of things like vodka, rum, and whiskey. And here we're talking about moderate consumption, and I'm acknowledging that the distinction from excessive consumption. One might raise a kind of question about the relevance of comparing Canada and Zambia, Canada being a very high income developed country on a different continent. But I'm making the case here, I think 19th century Canada and contemporary Zambia are valid points for comparison, valid case studies. So Canada in the 19th century was a large developing country with low levels of population density, low levels of GDP per capita. Canada then had a comparative advantage in agriculture and minerals. So in many ways resembles Zambia today. So the kind of the stories of the two about how does one kind of shift towards industrialization and the potential role of beer and brewing in that situation, I think is a valid, they do make valid points of comparison. And I think, although I'm kind of got a very explicit, let's say, small case study here of beer and brewing, there are more generalized stories of relevance here that we could be talking about brewing, but we could also be talking much more generally about all sorts of beverages and bottling as a kind of an industrial process. And I'll make some arguments later that this specific case study of brewing does have some very general and important points to make about the nature of national planning in Zambia. And I very obviously acknowledge that there's a big sense of a kind of a cultural perspective here, that talking about the relevance of beer and brewing is valid in Zambia. Zambia is a kind of a beer drinking, predominantly Christian country. And what we're talking about now, policy recommendations and so on, isn't going to be relevant for Zanzibar, where CCI are also working, which is something like 99% Muslim. Okay, so importance of industrialization. Now this I'm not going to dwell upon in any detail. This is the theoretical background for why brewing as a big industry, why it can be good for economic development. That this work on why industrialization is good, or why structural change from agriculture and rural to urban industry is good for economic growth. A lot of the key work on this dates back to the 1960s, Nicholas Kaldor writing about structural change. But I'm just going to assert here, but not explain in any detail, that industrialization is good for productivity growth. Demand for industry on world market tends to outpace that for agriculture, so there's more rapid demand growth. Industrial manufacturing is more exportable, more tradable. It's more easy to use new technology. There are a lot of examples of industry being associated with labor-intensive, semi-skilled in economic growth. So it generates a lot of employment for poor people. So industrial growth is often associated with reductions in poverty. And historically, industrialization has been closely associated with creating jobs specifically for young, less skilled women. So whether we're talking about the 1780s in Britain, the 1850s in the US, the 1920s in Japan, 1980s in China, industrialization has created lots of jobs for young women, which has led to all sorts of social transformations, raising the status of women, reducing female mortality, and in turn increasing the status of having girl children in a household and increasing the medical and educational opportunities for girl children. So I'm not going to dwell on that, suffice just to point out lots of widely accepted benefits for industrialization, one component of which is brewing. So my kind of thesis is that Zambia neglects the role of brewing as part of industrialization. And I've got perhaps a kind of bit more of a superficial analysis in the next few slides. And here, be very grateful to hear more from my colleagues Kalemba and Zondwayo, who are much more integrated into the policy-making process in Zambia, just a kind of a tester. Is this, am I correct in this point that brewing is a relatively neglected sector when it comes to the government's thinking about industrialization? So I looked at, next three slides are the three most recent national development plans, which run over approximately the last 15 or so years. As this is stating what the government are intending to do, their priorities, their policies over the next 5-year period. And we can see here industry and manufacturing get a lot of mentions in these national development plans, 188 in the 5th, 99 in the 6th, 132 in the 7th. What's interesting here is that, while textiles gets a decent number of mentions across all three national plans, beverages does, even tobacco does, brewing, as far as I could see, didn't get a single mention in any of these three national plans. The only time alcohol gets one mention in each of these three plans in a kind of very negative sense. So in the 5th plan, it's in a sentence about substance abuse and AIDS. In the 6th plan, again, diseases, substance abuse. And in the 7th national plan, alcohol gets mentioned in a sentence about moral decay. So kind of very negative perception, or either absence or a kind of brief but negative view of alcohol. This is not, I think, because these are moralistic national development plans. So, for example, there's quite a lot of discussion of tobacco farming, tobacco processing, which is a kind of widely recognized damaging substance in other ways. So this, I don't think this is because these are a kind of moralistic national plans. There's something else going on here that may or may not explain the absence of brewing. And I think what is also interesting, and this is something I'll draw on, highlight at the end of my presentation, is that while industry and manufacturing both get an awful lot of mentions in all three national plans, specific sectors are infrequently discussed. So almost 200 mentions of industry, but only 10 mentions of textiles. So to my mind, this illustrates that national planning, this desire to promote industrialization, is a bit vague in Zambia. A lot of desire and policies discussing industry at a very general level, but very few specific plans for specific sectors. And this, I think, contrasts very strikingly with national development planning in Ethiopia, where they also have a very strong steer towards industry and manufacturing, but then a lot of emphasis on which are the priority sectors and kind of individually tailored strategies for those individual sectors. So this is a kind of much more general picture about national development planning in Zambia. So there's the specific zero mention of brewing in any three of these national development plans, but also I think there's slightly more a lack of strategy, lack of sectoral strategy in these three national development plans. So I'll come on now to kind of I can say the meat of the presentation, given this is a beverage themed presentation. But anyway, the beverage of this presentation, brewery as an anchor tenant. So by anchor tenant here, I'm drawing an analogy to shopping malls, where the first thing a shopping mall often likes to do is attract a single big investor like a department store or a supermarket, which can be guaranteed a decent number of customers, and which in turn attracts a lot of other smaller and more specialized shops to invest in that mall. So here I'm asking whether brewery can be an anchor tenant, whether it can attract other investors. whether a brewery generates linkages and wider benefits with the rest of the domestic economy. And I'm going to make a case that systematically the answer to that is yes, brewery would, does, and will make a good anchor tenant in Zambia, as it did in Canada, as it does in other developing countries. So first of all, tax revenue. In economics parlance, alcohol has a low price elasticity of demand, which means a tax-induced increase in the price of alcohol won't have much impact on the demand for alcohol, which means in economic terms, it's a fairly efficient tax, and in practical terms means it's going to raise a lot of revenue quite easily. And looking at those books on beeronomics, the importance of taxation from alcohol has been profound throughout history. So during the 19th century, for example, Britain largely paid for its navy, its army, its overseas colonization through the proceeds of alcohol taxation. So alcohol taxation transformed global history. It funded colonialism. And in recent years, we can see in Zambia, tax revenue from alcohol has been a very buoyant source of revenue, a kind of very predictable source of revenue. Would be great to get more detailed data on this, and Kalemba Zondwayo perhaps is something we could chat about afterwards. But you imagine there's a few big breweries in Zambia. It's easier to tax those than to tax the income of millions of Zambians located all over the place. In political terms, there's a widespread acceptance of taxing alcohol in Zambia and most other countries. In a way, there's a more of a political problem of taxing things like food or land or mining. So it's politically, it's a relatively easy tax. Economically, it's an efficient tax. It's structural change. For more than 1,000 years, breweries have pioneered industrialization. So going right back to the early 9th century under the European emperor, under Emperor Charlemagne, breweries were the largest industries, typically located in monasteries. And ever since, over the last 1,000 years, breweries have pioneered industrialization. Breweries pioneered industrialization earlier than the more famous stories related to cotton textiles. City of Toronto was founded in 1793. The first industry of any size were breweries. And we can go right down to present day Zambia. In 2022, Zambian breweries announced an $80 million capital investment, one of the largest industrial investment projects in Zambia. So breweries pioneer industrialization. And they do so even in low-income markets where there exists a fairly big demand for beer, even at fairly low levels of income. Linkages. But here I make the case that brewing provides a good leading sector or a good anchor tenant. It generates linkages with the rest of the economy. It can perform the role of a leading sector. As brewing expands, it generates demand, it generates jobs, it generates investment in the rest of the country. I mean, we could compare that, for example, to electronics, which is something a lot of developing countries are fairly obsessed about, trying to attract electronics factories into their to host electronics factories. But typically electronics factories tend to import all of their components from overseas, do a little bit of assembly work, and then export the final product. They're enclaves. They don't generate many linkages with the rest of the economy. In contemporary Zambia, there are all sorts of deep linkages between brewing and the domestic economy. So the printing, the bottling, the distribution, input for purchases from local farmers, the kind of the forward linkages into the pub, the restaurants, and the tourism of Zambia. One estimate, and I didn't see how this was calculated, suggested that there were 80,000 jobs in Zambia dependent on the brewing sector. A growing market in a developing country. Governments are often criticised for trying to pick winners. This is a common criticism of industrial policy, to work out which sectors can or should be successful, promote them, and then try and reap the long-term dividends. And there's a long history of governments making unsuccessful efforts to pick winners. But brewing in Zambia, I would suggest, is something of a guaranteed winner. International studies of the income elasticity of demand, this shows how demand goes up as incomes increase, shows that the income elasticity of demand is about 0.5 to 0.8. This means as incomes go up, people tend to consume a lot more beer. Studies show that the peak demand for beer occurs at an average income level of about $20,000 or $30,000 per person. So Zambia, with a GDP per capita of a bit more than $3,000 per person, is going to face decades of rising demand for beer. So first one, high income elastic demand. Second, Zambia has a very young population. Some 42% of its population of 20 million people are between the ages of 0 and 14. And studies, although conducted not in Zambia, in other countries, show that peak beer consumption tends to occur in your middle to late 30s. Again, it means the age structure of Zambia suggests that demand is going to grow in the future. And also, a kind of fairly unsurprising empirical study shows that beer consumption is closely related to religion. Christians and Protestants drink much more than Jews or Muslims. And Zambia, slightly under 96% of Zambia's population are Christian. So Zambia will very likely see rising beer consumption in recent decades. Foreign direct investment. So Zambia, like many other developing countries, has embraced the idea that foreign direct investment is a good thing. Zambia has various policies to try and attract foreign direct investment based on the ideas that foreign investors bring with them new technology, new management methods, and they provide kind of a demonstration or a learning effect for local firms. Now, if you read the history, the history of beeronomics, opening up or the marketization of various parts of the world has been closely associated with foreign investment from brewing. This was true in the USSR and Central and Eastern Europe in the 1990s, India in the 1990s, China in the 1980s and 1990s, and Zambia in the 1990s and 2000s. All of these examples saw opening up being very closely associated with a surge of foreign investment. So brewing can lead foreign investment. Sixthly, domestic production. So there's an often voiced concern about trade liberalization and foreign investment, that it can induce deindustrialization. So this is one of the concerns voiced about the African Union's free trade agreement. It's one of the concerns discussed in the context of opening up to Chinese investment and Chinese trade, is that cheaper, more efficient, low-cost industrial production in places like China or Vietnam will enter Africa, deindustrialize Africa, and Africa will be pushed back to exporting raw materials and be stuck on a kind of a lower growth trajectory. Now, a good positive aspect, whether one believes those stories or not, a positive aspect of brewing is that it tends to be associated with domestic production and domestic sales. So beer is a relatively heavy and low value added good. Empirically, people tend to be attached to local brands. So Zambians like to drink Mozzie beer. So this means that local consumption tends to be met in the brewing sector by local production. So opening up free trade and so on in brewing does not lead to deindustrialization. It tends to strengthen local industrialization or local production for local consumption. Last point here, brewing and clean water. So sort of very tragically, I think last year there was an outbreak of cholera in Zambia. Last estimate I saw suggested around 300 people had died. I think one of the great tragedies of outbreaks like this is that the technology to deal with cholera is very simple and has been known for more than 100 years, clean water and sanitation. Empirical studies like Paris in the 19th century or US cities at the beginning of the 20th century show that the provision of clean water and sanitation can have transformative effects on morbidity and mortality. So the provision of clean water to US cities at the early 20th century was associated with or caused a 75% decline in infant mortality. One study has estimated the cost to benefit ratio of investment in clean water, or the return, of 23 to 1. So for every $1 of expenditure, one generates $23 of social benefits from investment in clean water. But why then is Zambia and other countries not providing clean water and sanitation? Well, there's a big politics to explain this. It's a very expensive piece of infrastructure, particularly when trying to retrofit an already built city. It's difficult to devise ways of connecting up the poorest who may be living in slums, or working out a means of the poorest paying for clean water or providing it through taxation. And then quite often the middle classes in many developing countries have opted out of agitating for clean water because they can afford filtration systems or bottled water. Now, good thing about brewing, and this is true in contemporary and the historical world, is that brewers have formed a very powerful lobby to push the government to provide clean water. In many cases, actually paying for the provision of clean water themselves. This is true going right back 500 years to the Netherlands in the 16th century. This was true of Toronto in the 19th century. This is also true of Zambia in 2022. Brewers form a powerful lobby, corporate lobby, in favor of clean water. This is a quote I got from Zambia Breweries' yearly report, talking about the effort and engagement they've undertaken in terms of promoting and clean water and cleaning up water in Zambia. Most of a beer, the biggest input into beer is water, and that water has to be clean. Just kind of going back a bit, this is a picture of the Dominion breweries in the 1880s in Toronto, and this is a picture of Zambia breweries recently, just to illustrate the point that these always have been, going back 1,000 years, the biggest and earliest industrial establishments in any developing country. So concluding my presentation, my main point here is that I'm not suggesting any particular policy changes. This is unusual for a policy brief, which tends to present a particular sector and then say, oh, this sector needs lots of incentives, lots of favourable treatment, subsidies, tax concessions. My point here is that these already exist in the case of Zambia. Zambia's open to trade, it's open to foreign investment. Through the special economic zones known in Zambia as MFEZ, multi-facility economic zones. There are fairly generous incentives for industrial firms to locate in Zambia. Rather, this is a presentation which is about emphasis and implementation. So studies show that investment promotion authorities, like the Zambia Development Agency, ZIPAR, work best when they have a clear list of priority sectors, and they work well when they engage in proactive outreach with foreign investors. So they have a clearly politically defined list of target sectors, and then they engage in an outreach program to target foreign investors in those sectors. So this is a suggestion that ZDA, the Zambian government policy process, should be much more explicit about its target sectors and include brewing on that list, and be much more actively engaged with assisting brewers in Zambia, working with them, or attracting more foreign investment from overseas in the brewing sector. Zambia already has policies related to smallholder agriculture, already has policies related to local content, so is already kind of keen to do that. So I don't think any new policies are needed in that sense. And kind of stepping back from the specific case study of brewing, I think there are some kind of bigger lessons we can derive. First of all, one often hears when talking about Zambia or other countries that Zambia should adopt best practice. I don't know, best practice like Denmark or Singapore, but often that is impossible. And I think we should place much more emphasis on thinking about relevant lessons for a country like Zambia. And I would suggest that the case of 19th century Canada is, it's a very different historical context perhaps, but it is a relevant lesson for Zambia. We're talking about then a big developing country with a comparative advantage in minerals and agriculture, with a very kind of low density of population, and thinking about how Canada transitioned into modern industrialization, often through brewery as a leading sector, provides relevant lessons for the case of contemporary Zambia. And then finally, and this is a kind of a bigger picture question, suggestion about the process of national development planning in Zambia. Zambia very clearly aspires to promote industrialization and manufacturing. I suggest there are lots of good reasons for doing that, but its national development plans are much more vague about, well, which are the sectors that can lead that process. I mean, even textiles only gets 10 mentions, beverages 6. So lots of general discussion, but very little specific discussion, feasibility studies and so on about which sectors should be promoted. And I would suggest that, the development planning in somewhere like Ethiopia, which is much more explicit about the key economic sectors that the government are going to be partnering with or promoting, there provides a good role model. So this is not here just a call for much more mentioning or discussion of brewing in national development plans, but a call that Zambia should be much clearer or much more thoughtful, think more carefully about which are the priority sectors for ZDA and the government more generally to promote. So I will draw to a halt there, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was very insightful. And I think for me, what is really illuminating is that relationship that you highlight, the role of the brewing industry in facilitating investments in water and sanitation. I think it's a really interesting point. But at this point, allow me to turn to our discussants. Allow me to briefly introduce them. We have Ms. Kalemba Mpandamwike from the Zambia Institute for Policy Analysis and Research. By way of introduction, she is an economist with experience in economic research and policy analysis. She works, as an associate researcher in the Trade and Investment Unit at ZIPAR. Beyond that, she has contributed significantly to various policies in Zambia, most notably to the micro, small, and medium enterprise development policy. Her research areas of interest include trade, tourism, industrialization, and private sector development. Kalemba is very passionate about economic development and contributing to the development of Zambia's private sector. Kalemba, good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Good morning, online participant.
All right. Before we invite you to discuss Matthew's paper, I would like to also just give a brief introduction of our second discussant. This is Mr. Zondwayo Duma from the Zambia Association of Manufacturers. He currently works as a policy lead at ZAM, where he manages the policy and research department. He possesses extensive work experience in private sector development and policy formulation and analysis, as well as facilitating public-private sector dialogue. Further, Zondwayo has served on various national committees in Zambia and is currently the chairperson of the National Technical Business Development Fund that is hosted by the National Technological Business Council. He has contributed significantly to policy advocacy in Zambia, which is aimed at promoting Zambia's economic growth and development, particularly of the manufacturing sector. Zondwayo, good morning.
Good morning, Wanda, and I'm happy to be here.
All right, thank you so much. All right, so Kalemba, back to you. You have 5 minutes, and thereafter, Zondwayo, you can take over and provide us your feedback as well regarding the paper and overall the role of the brewing industry in economic development. Thank you.
Thank you, Wanda, and thank you, Matthew, for that presentation. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to CCI and ZAM for giving us the opportunity to comment on this topic. So I must say I'm looking forward to hearing the views of the participants as well on this quite contentious topic. And I say it's contentious because in as much as it carries with it vast economic benefits, it also carries with it social costs as well as some economic costs. So I did enjoy reading the paper, and I must say it has a catchy title. Matthew has a thing for catchy titles. Yeah, so the paper makes a good case for the brewing industry and how it contributes to economic development in terms of being easy to tax. So therefore, it contributes a lot to tax revenue, the promotion of industrialization, attracting foreign direct investments, and as well as the linkages to other sectors, such as agriculture. So so seeing that the paper proposes that Zambia leverage on expanding the beer industry, it would have been interesting to get like a deeper understanding on the social costs that come with expanding the industry. So expanding the industry either through foreign direct investments or domestic investments would then lead to a higher supply of beer on the market. And so from economic theory, we know that a higher supply is likely to lead to a lower price. So then a lower price would then make it more accessible to more Zambians who already have a problem with alcohol abuse. So I'll just highlight some statistics that were highlighted in the World Health Organization report of 2014. So in the report, it was highlighted that the 12-month prevalence of alcohol use disorders among Zambians above the age of 15, including alcohol dependence and the harmful use of alcohol, was 7.9% for males and 1% for females. And then the overall rate for both males and females was 4.5%, which is above the WHO African average of 3.3%. So Zambians are already grappling with alcohol abuse. And then apart from the statistics, we also just see it around. So therefore, increasing this, so it would have been good to see the social costs, because alcohol abuse also places costs on productivity levels, and it also puts a demand on the healthcare resulting from alcohol use related disorders. So I know it's a bit difficult to quantify the social costs, but it would have been nice to see that. And then with alcohol abuse, it would have been nice to see how much the government is spending on road transport, on road traffic accidents that result from alcohol abuse, and also just the strain that it can put on the police services, which could result from high crime rates. So then when we have an idea of the costs, we could then carry out a cost benefit analysis to see if it's really worth it for us to expand this industry, given the costs that are attached to it. And then additionally, it would be good for us to also harness on the informal sector, because we've seen recently a rise in the cottage industry, in the cottage brewing industry. So we've had on the news, we've seen stories of informal brewers who are producing beer that has even in some instances killed people. So then it would be good for Zambia to harness on the cottage industry, which has been for a long time viewed as an illicit brew. So it would be good for us to harness on that and bring them into the formal sector, because then bringing them into the informal sector will increase tax revenue, as it was highlighted above. And it also increase the safety of the beer that's being consumed, which will make it safer for the consumers. Yeah, so that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kalemba. Interesting thoughts on those trade-offs between industry itself, driving productivity growth, economic growth, versus the sort of social costs, also costs on productivity in other sectors. Looking forward to hearing Matthew's views on that. But before he comes in, Zondwayo, over to you.
Thank you. I hope you can get me clearly. All right, thank you. So such an interesting conversation we're having here, and it sparks a lot of conversation in a field that has been ignored for some time for various reasons. I feel we all tend to get a bit careful when conversations of beer are introduced, just as it would be for cigarettes and so on. But either way, this is a very important sector for Zambia's economic development, and contributes over 12,000 jobs for the people locally. And most of all also contributes heavily towards revenue and so on. Unfortunately, the sector is subjected to a lot of challenges, which then I appreciate that the paper seeks to address. Some of these challenges are drawn towards a policy environment. Tax policy has not been so favorable for players in this sector, and in many cases being a little more unstable. Therefore, many players have failed to be competitive, and especially the smaller players failing to take off to compete favorably. Another thing that is addressed in the paper is that of linkages development. So we observe that just like many other manufacturing companies, the beer industry also has very strong linkages to other sectors, such as agriculture, logistics, and many more. But unfortunately, this has been constrained at different levels. And one of these constraints could be an aspect drawn towards tax as well. You will observe that for an outgrower of for value addition based off an outgrower scheme, the producer would have to pay 35% tax, whilst a player strictly focusing on agriculture will only pay 15%, which then makes it a bit less motivating for value addition and making it easier to continue with the current path. So those are some of the issues that we face. But then one key thing that was also mentioned is the issue of illicit trade and illicit consumption. So you will observe that the sector is mainly it faces a lot of criticism because of illicit consumption. But then you also observe that most of the illicit consumed alcohol is also subject to illicit trade, really, and not really drawn from the formal players. This then makes the sector a little more constrained in that area. Unfortunately, it affects revenues for the formal players, and most of all denies government the much needed revenue for various development programs. As the Zambia Association of Manufacturers, we've been working with different players to aid this vice, to aid addressing this challenge. We are working with the different government ministries and agencies just to ensure that this is addressed. The battle is yet to be won, but we are happy that we are making progress, and would like to encourage everyone to be a whistleblower. So if you observe suspicious behavior in illicit trade, please feel free to reach out to us so that we can fight this challenge together. So, and then the other aspect that was mentioned was that of sustainability. It's also interesting to note that some players have taken up the initiative to drive sustainability because of the various issues that come with illicit, with alcohol consumption. There's the disposal of how you dispose the bottles and so on have a critical impact on the environment. But some of the players are working together to ensure that the bottles are picked up and recycled and many other ways just relevant to ensuring sustainability. So in a nutshell, that's my discussion. And I would love to make mention that this is a very good starting point. I foresee a lot of conversation being brought up after this paper.
Thank you so much, Zondwayo. Interesting points that you raised as well, the potential for a circular economy tied to beer. But let me not preempt. Matthew, over to you, your reaction to what has been provided by the two discussants.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mwenda. And so, responding first to Kalemba's point, so I think, I didn't dwell on the social costs of alcohol. I acknowledged them, but didn't dwell on them, partly because it's very easy to see existing discussion on the social costs. I mean, looking at those national development plans, all of them portray alcohol only in a very negative way, like sort of substance abuse, moral decay suggestions. And then brewing is complete absence. So this is kind of a response to those existing arguments, the problems of alcohol. And this is, let's say, the positive case for beer and brewing. I kind of love the idea about doing a cost-benefit analysis. That would be great. I think, talking about, it's easy to think, well, more beer just means people are doing more bad things. But I think there's probably more nuance in that argument, that I suspect most people who are not drinking beer are not leading kind of completely healthy lifestyles. They're probably drinking very potent, often adulterated, home-produced beer. They're probably taking some form of recreational drugs. So in some ways, expanding this kind of not very strong, cleanly produced formal sector alcohol is going to displace some of these more harmful substances. More beer could be less adulterated home-produced beer. And I kind of made the point that we often forget about that strong health link. Where you have a big politically influential brewing industry, you tend to get a lot of clean action on clean water, so there would be health benefits from that. And then as a source of tax, a good source of tax revenue, it's often beer that pays for things like the health system, the police force and roads, so more than ameliorates any negative impacts on those sectors from more consumption of alcohol. Responding to Zondwayo's points there, I kind of agree. We're careful about discussing beer, and there's some political implications of doing so, and maybe policy advisors and the government have face some constraints in doing so. But there is a puzzle there, in the sense that those national development plans do talk about tobacco. There are fairly decent, detailed plans for expanding the amount of tobacco that is planted, for increasing the processing of locally grown tobacco. So there's the tobacco plans. So why is it seemingly okay to talk about tobacco but not alcohol? And that, Zondwayo, very thanks there for those points about taxation, which be great to continue that conversation, get more details from you after the webinar about taxation being unstable, and about that specific disadvantage faced by smaller or emergent brewers. And that is something particularly important in this sector, because in a lot of countries, the brewing industry has been transformed by the emergence of micro breweries. So this is bars with a brewery attached next door, or kind of small breweries that supply a local market, often supplying kind of quite quirky top-end beers. And this process has transformed brewing in a lot of countries, not just high-income countries, but also in countries like India. And I haven't seen this process in Africa yet, where places like Tanzania, Zambia tend to be still dominated by a few national breweries. So the emergent or small scale sector is of particular importance in brewing, and this would be something to look at in terms of framing policy suggestions. And then finally, that point made about outgrowing, using inputs from agriculture as an industrial input, and the problems with taxation in sector, the disincentives faced by taxation. That sounds like a policy which needs more investigation. But I would suggest this doesn't have to be done under the auspices of let's give special benefits to brewing. This is the Zambian government have a quite clearly articulated policy in wanting to promote the small scale sector and supplying inputs to industry. I think this is a general policy which is relevant for all of agriculture and industry, not one that is peculiar to the brewing industry. So I think policy suggestions in that area wouldn't need to be framed in terms of let's change the outgrower policies in order to benefit brewing. This is let's change outgrower policies in order to benefit small scale farmers and the industries to which they supply inputs. So yeah, thank you very much, both. Some great comments. I've made a careful note of those. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Matthew. I think there's a lot to discuss, interesting insights coming from your paper, coming from the discussants as well on taxation, circular economy, social costs, many things. But for now, we would want to turn to our distinguished participants who have joined us. We're now getting into the Q&A session, so please feel free to pose your questions. As mentioned earlier, you can raise your hand and we will facilitate for you to go ahead and speak. Alternatively, you can post your question in the Q&A tab that is on your screen, and Matthew or the discussants will respond to that. I see a question from Kingsley, so allow me to read it out as we wait for more questions to come through. So Kingsley says, it is very interesting that the paper is based on Zambia as a Christian nation. It would be good to also have an analysis that shows the economic development of cities without the involvement of beer. Case in point, Dubai and other non-Christian Middle Eastern countries. Matthew, your response to that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say in any of those cases we can think about those cities without beer. I mean, I've sipped beer in Dubai. It's very easily available. I've done so in Zanzibar, where brewing is illegal, but there's a lot of beer. In those countries, beer tends to be more narrowly confined to tourist hotels and those kind of amenities. So it tends to be associated with the tourist sector, does tend to generate quite a lot of tax revenue because there's a lot of tourists in Dubai and Zanzibar, it generates revenue. But also in those places, there's a fairly widespread and thriving informal sector, home produced beers and so on, and that the illegalization of it drives a lot of it underground and deprives the government of a lot of tax revenue. So I don't think I mean, even let's say in somewhere like Pakistan, where alcohol is illegal, it's only illegal for the Muslim population. Pakistan does have a number of big breweries, and if one is Christian or Hindu or other religions, one can apply for a license to purchase alcohol. But there's an enormous black market in beer and other alcohol, and it's very easy to acquire. And I think going back to that point Zondwayo made, one of the problems of these kind of restrictions is that they push people into consuming spirits, hard alcohol, because it's easy to smuggle bottles of whiskey, bottles of rum. These are high value added small items, so smuggling tends to be diverted towards the spirits and the hard liquor and away from beer. So where you have greater legalization or greater production, you tend to shift away from spirits towards beer. So you shift away from the more harmful alcohols towards the less harmful low alcohol beers. But thank you for that question. Good question.
So maybe just to follow up, because Kingsley has clarified that his question was in the context of investments in the brewing industry, which is non-existent in Dubai. So any comments on that, Matthew?
Well, then one deprives oneself of the chance of having a big factory and lots of employment and all of the benefits that are derived from that process, and shifting. Well, Dubai is still creating employment in brewing. It's just doing so in whatever country from which it is importing. Zanzibar is a good case there. So you can't brew beer in Zanzibar. It's imported from overseas. It's widely available at hotels and resorts, but that means the benefits from it are derived from elsewhere. And it also turns it into a kind of a politics, in the sense, which are the few people in Zanzibar that have a license to import alcohol, get an enormous rent from that process without really adding any value. And there's a risk of kind of corrupting that process. Who has the licenses, who controls the allocation of those licenses. So not having domestic brewing just transfers the benefits of producing it overseas, and can generate a kind of politics of rent seeking and corruption around the allocation of licenses to do the importing.
Your argument is that, sorry, so your argument is that greater benefits can be derived if you actually add investments in country, as opposed to and selling it.
Well, you have those benefits. Dubai creating those benefits, but those benefits are overseas. Whichever overseas country is brewing the beer and exporting it to Dubai is generating the benefits, rather than those benefits being in Dubai and employing people in factories in Dubai.
All right, thank you, Matthew. So just a reminder, you can ask your question by raising your hand using the function here on your screen, which says raise hand. And our tech team will unmute you so that you can go ahead and speak. Alternatively, you can pose the question in the Q&A tab. We have a second question from Kanyanta, and he is asking, is the demand for alcoholic beverages in developing countries sensitive to price? I think you briefly touched on this, Matthew. Maybe you can reiterate.
Sure. Yeah. So unfortunately, there are not enough developing country specific studies on what in economics we call the price elasticity of demand. That's how price changes to how demand changes to varying prices. So if you tax a beer, what happens to the quantity demanded? The studies that have been done, typically in developed countries, show that the demand is fairly price inelastic. That's as you increase the price through taxation, the demand for beer does not change that much. There's a kind of a complication in somewhere like Zambia, in that there's a big home-brewed beer industry. So there's a possibility that if you tax formal sector alcohol, people can shift back into home-produced beer, or what's that kind of porridge type beer you can buy supermarket. There's kind of different types of beer. There's the kind of the formal sector motley. There's those porridgey type beers in cartons, and also home produced beers. So there is a kind of a possibility that the price elasticity of demand is a bit lower in Zambia, because people can more easily shift back into those alternative types of beer. But I think one looks at Zambia, and even during periods of declining incomes, negative economic growth, the demand for beer has been fairly robust in Zambia. So I would suggest that the suggestive evidence is the price elasticity of demand is probably a bit lower than developed countries, but is still likely to be such that it's a good source of tax revenue.
So just on that point regarding the price elasticity of demand, if I may, and linking this to Zondwayo's point about taxation, and I would love to hear from you both, Matthew and Zondwayo. I mean, you talk about how, increases in price will not necessarily have a negative impact on demand. So can you argue that the taxation, the corporate tax that's imposed on brewing firms is justified? Because we know that either way, they're likely to recoup their investments and generate sufficient revenues to keep them afloat. What is your take on that? Is there really a justified case to be thinking about having a lower corporate income tax for those that are brewing beer?
So I think when we talk about price elasticity demand, we're talking about excise duties or VAT. brewing is or alcohol is a relatively efficient product on which to impose those kind of taxes because the demand doesn't change very much. So you put VAT. Many countries also impose kind of special duties, excise duties on alcohol, like UK and elsewhere. Demand doesn't change, they're good revenue earners. I think it's a different question talking about corporation tax, because if we change the rate of corporation tax on brewing, then investors are going to make decisions about which sectors to invest. So I think I don't think I'm really talking about corporation tax here. That would have implications for whether it's worth investing in Zambia, whether it's worth undertaking this $80 million capital expansion that Zambian brewers are currently undertaking. That is like a kind of a different question from thinking about taxes on the retail price of alcohol. So corporation tax, I suggest probably not for cutting corporation tax for brewers, but I do think it's quite sensible to pile on VAT, excise duties on alcohol, and there's a fairly easy politics of doing that. Not many people object to taxing alcohol in the way they do object to income tax or land tax or taxes on foodstuffs.
Zondwayo, your thoughts on that before we get to more questions?
Okay, so I think Matthew has set a very good foundation for the discussion based off the question. I just have one issue that I feel is very cardinal when we're talking about alcohol. Of course, taxes may not really have an impact on demand and so on, but they turn out to be a driver for illicit activity. So we may do away with demand and so on, but then supply will continue. Unfortunately, it will come from the wrong places, and that's not something we would want, both for the producer and on government revenue.
All right, thank you so much. Let me turn to Visasi Piri, who has also asked a question. Are there measures in place to reduce the amount of corporate social responsibility that brewers or retailers need to pay? I hope I read it correctly. I'm not too sure if, please clarify, do you mean to reduce or induce more? But it says to reduce the amount of corporate social responsibility that those in the brewing industries or retailers need to pay.
I mean, I can have a bash at that one. I mean, so I'm not sure of the specifics in the case of Zambia, what the rules and regulations are about corporate social responsibility, whether it's a legal obligation on firms or whether firms are just doing it to sort of burnish their corporate image. And that's not something I particularly looked at. But what I think is important in the case of brewing is that brewers have an economic incentive to push for clean water. And history shows that quite often big brewers have actually paid for cleaning up water themselves, or they've formed a corporate lobby through business association pushing the government into cleaning up water. And they've also provided a lot of the tax revenue that's enabled the government to do that. So one of the problems with corporate social responsibility is kind of relying on corporations to do something which is not really in their private interests, and it costs money, it's going to reduce profits. What is good about brewing is you can just rely on incentives. It's profitable. It makes sense for brewers to push for cleaning up water. So it kind of aligns. When talking about brewing, we're aligning incentives. We're not relying on the corporate sector to do something it doesn't really want to do because it reduces profits.
And I think that was the interesting observation from your paper, right? That it can actually allow you to easily align the various interests. So then you benefit as a country, right, from the investments that are coming in water and sanitation. And the corporates are not really being induced or forced to do it, but they are equally incentivized to do it because clean water is very critical to the production of beer. All right. I wanted to point out another key observation from your paper, Matthew. You talk about the common practice of multinational corporations coming into many countries and buying out the local firms. We've seen it in Zambia. I think you give that example, as well as in Europe. Should we be concerned about ownership? I mean, granted, the production is happening in the country, but obviously being multinationals, there's that risk that, repatriation of funds that would have otherwise stayed within the country and further benefited, the country that they're investing in. Is that something we need to be concerned about? If you could just touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, good point. So that's something I think I've discussed a little bit more in the paper, less so in this presentation, that the brewing sector internationally has become incredibly concentrated in a very few number of very large firms, and that these international conglomerates have bought out local producers in Zambia. So yeah, I mean, anybody concerned about, let's say, the power of big multinational corporations against developing country governments could legitimately be concerned. I mean, these brewing companies derive much